Good morning, everyone. So good to have you here, and excited about our second presentation in this, our 7th year of Tuesdays with lectures sponsored by the Friends of the Georgetown Library. I think I know most of you, but just to reaffirm and to remind, I'm Bob Willey, and I've had the privilege to serve for the last 8 years as the president of the Friends of the Georgetown Library, and it is a privilege. I always say in the context of what is the wonderful library and the incredible staff. And we were just talking about the wonderful library that's being fixed, considerably updated, and I'll give an update on that after the presentation. And a library staff that's all over the place. Dan is upstairs in the executive suite here at the auditorium. Julie is at the Maritime Museum. You're at home. But there's some down at the Southern Library, some at Carver's Bay. They're all over. And Aaron, who's back there recording all this, is at the County Museum. And I mention all that because it's reflective of what I see as the wonderful relationship here in Georgetown of the various nonprofit organizations supportive of each other. And even here, again, I'll say it afterwards, how gracious the Wynyard Auditorium committee is in allowing us to be able to use this. We sent a very sad note to them of how we were homeless and had no place to go, and the tears were just pouring down when they said yes as we expressed our situation. Tuesdays With, as most of you know, is named after a 1997 bestseller, Tuesdays with Morrie, a really great book if you've never read it, and we once in a while sell it at our used book sales. That's an advertisement. But it's a great book, and we chose this title because it's reflective of what our purpose is, and that is the continuing education for people through all ages. And that is to say, when you finish high school or you finish college or whatever you went on to do in graduate school, learning does not stop. And it's the intent of going on, which is what that book talks about, a ongoing relationship between a college student and his professor that went long after the college years were over. And so we're excited to be able to have Tuesday with Bob Raynor today. We were in contact quite a few months back. I usually about a year ahead try to get our speakers, and Bob's new book was coming out. That was pre-publication, I think, when we first started communicating. And so we're very excited to have Bob here to be able to speak today. He is a longtime resident of Allendale, studied at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, still present tense or past tense recreational therapist? Retired recreational therapist in psychology at what is the Medical University of South Carolina, an avid sailor, and a great writer. Carol and I had the opportunity, I think it was just after COVID, to go out to Bull Island, and he's written an outstanding book. That was my first introduction to Bob, and it was our guide as we went around Bull Island and had the opportunity to...
Shameless self-promotion.
And today's presentation is on that new book, the Santee Delta, Waters and Voices, and that's the title of the presentation. It's my privilege to introduce Bob Raynor.
Thank you, Bob. I want to thank Bob for this introduction to be part of this series, which I didn't even know about. And I also want to thank the Georgetown County Library that have been so supportive of everything that I've done. It's been great. I have a question for you. Microphone or no microphone? No, that's fine. I'm just going to be two-fisted, okay? Two-fisted. But that's okay, and it'll be easier to do that. But I want to thank Julie, who's been great. You'll see images from Georgetown County Library in this presentation, and they're also in the book, correct? Yes. So great stuff from the library. So I took a very broad approach in this book to the Santee Delta. It's really a portrait of the Delta. In this presentation, you will see a number of images, both my photographs as well as historic ones. We will have Q&A at the end, but with this size group, I'm going to entertain questions during the presentation. If there's something that you're like, what's that? Or, what did you just say, Bob? I may also ask you some questions too. And I know Venny will have a couple answers to those questions. Okay, so I drove across the Santee Delta from Allendale on the way here this morning. It really is a flat expanse. It's almost a hidden world. But this place was transformed, and that's the main thing that I really look at in the book, is how the Delta has been transformed, but certainly with rice culture and slavery, how that has been transformed, and we're going to look at that in this. So my approach has been doing lots of research. That includes reading, archival research, maps. It includes an oral history project called Voices of the Santee Delta. I'm going to look at that more thoroughly. I've had a lot of experiences out in the Santee Delta, both walking in places, sailing, canoeing, and then also as a volunteer too. Venny Days Moore invited me to come to a archaeological project at Hampton Plantation back in 2013, and so that was a great experience, a slave dwelling excavation. You'll see some images from that. There are some really intriguing stories that I've encountered that I've sort of rounded out in the book. And it's a watery world. This is the South Santee River looking over at Murphy Island. There's the North Santee, there's some sounds, there are creeks, and then there are the impoundments. So when I looked at the Santee Delta, waters and voices, waters is the natural history, the nature part of it, and the voices were the people that lived or worked in the Delta, the people that traveled through it, some fascinating visitors. Yes, I have a couple earlier books, and these books were all built on the narrative of sailing trips that I took. In the first one, exploring Bull Island out to that island, and then walking around on the island, exploring the history. And then in the second book, tracing the Cape Romaine archipelago, sailing out to every island I could even get to, even little hammocks in the marsh, islands in the marsh, and explored that. Now, I told Bob I have a sort of a story that I haven't shared with any group so far, but this is the group to share it with. In my second book, you know, when you submit a manuscript these days, you don't print it out and take it to the publisher, you email it. You know, you email it. And so I sent that manuscript to my previous publisher. And you know, oftentimes you don't get a response to an email. Have any of you ever experienced that? And then you wait, and I finally said, okay. I sent emails, so what are you going to do? Are you going to publish this? And I waited, and I was at a conference in Myrtle Beach, and I got the answer. And the answer was, well, you submitted a 90,000 word manuscript. We would be more interested in publishing a 50,000 word manuscript. Do the math on that. So what 40,000 words do you want to cut out of it? So that was painful. That was painful. I didn't know what to do for a while. I was at a conference, but on my drive home, I stopped by this place. What place is that? Come on, Georgetown people. Right, Hobcaw Observation Pier, yes. On what river? It's the Black and the Great PD River. So yes, so it was there I had an epiphany. Because in the manuscript, I had done a good long chapter on Murphy Island, which is not part of Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, but it's just adjacent to all those islands. And I thought, well, if I took out that chapter, that would remove a lot of those words, and then I could leave that for the next book on the Santee Delta. It was great. It was great. And yet, what I didn't realize was it was a pretty naive decision too, because that was a big project to take on that I've been at for a number of years. But it worked, so that's how the book came about. And that's a true story. So I became a student of the Santee Delta in my research and visiting. And it's a much different approach than my earlier works. So it's not all these sailing trips, and it's quite different. I was very interested in the Santee Delta before it was colonized. So the prehistoric delta. Now, one thing about the Santee Delta, it is at the end of the Santee River, which has an incredible watershed. If you see this map here, by the way, are there any cartophiles in the audience today? People that love maps? Cartophiles? Yeah, okay, good, we got one hand. So this is incredible. So 40% of the watershed of the Santee, yes, thanks, Bob. Yeah, you're needing to put on sunglasses over there. You still got the sun in your eyes. You may want to move. I guess it's those upper windows. 40% of South Carolina is in the Santee watershed. And as you see, another 20% of that watershed goes up into North Carolina. Incredible size. So what was the Santee Delta like between the rivers before colonization? It was 10,000 acres of river swamp, of swamp forest. We're talking bald cypress and tupelo gum forest. This is an example from Beadler Forest. I hope a lot of you have been there. If not, put it on your list to go to Beadler Forest. Incredible place to walk and boardwalks out in this swamp forest. And you can also go to Congaree National Park, which also has a great swamp forest too, and boardwalks to get out there. I was also interested in the indigenous people, the people that lived before contact. And some of the visitors, particularly John Lawson in his book Through the Delta in 1700, had lots of interactions with the Sewees. So the Sewee Indians were a indigenous group that lived there. And in fact, they had a town right on the South Santee that was called King Jeremy's Plantation. Now, he wasn't a king, and it wasn't a plantation, but that's just what the colonizers called it. So it hasn't been found yet, even though they've looked at it at Hampton Plantation. It's not there, but I'm sure in the coming years they're going to find that, and it's going to be a great finding and learning about the Sewees, who no longer exist in this part of the world. Now, I did learn of another archaeological site that had been studied with indigenous people on Minnam Island along the ICW, the Intercoastal Waterway. So I decided to make a trip out there. This is the Pole Yard Landing on the North Santee. I made a sailing trip out in the fall, a cool, blustery day. And I had a hand-drawn map, and I found this site that was studied in the late 80s. You can see my vessel there, the Kingfisher. It's a sunfish craft boat. And you see this white on the bank here. Question for the group: what is all that white material? Egret soup? No, it's not poop. No, it's not poop. Yeah, it's shell midden. So it's the deposited remains from people. Mostly oyster shells, but there was certainly a lot of potsherds in there too. Here's a nice example of one that was just in the tidal rack. You can see the rim on that and how it was like punctured with a stick with a hole at the end. Beautiful potsherd. But anyway, this group had studied it because of the erosion on the Intercoastal Waterway, and what they found is that it was several families that live there seasonally. They travel down there, certainly probably on dugout canoes. And besides all those oyster shells, they found the bones of sturgeon and garfish. And sturgeon are very large fish. So it's interesting to imagine, because this site goes back to 1400 BC. And then it was occupied for a long time before it was abandoned. But amazing. Okay, I'm going to transition to the Voices of the Santee Delta project, which we did 2015. South Carolina Historical Society and the Village Museum from McClellanville. We wanted to find people who lived, resided, or worked in the Santee Delta and interview them and archive those interviews. And I wanted to thank those interviews again. We have no people in the audience that were there today. I'd hope Bill Mace would be here, but not. So let me introduce you to these 11 people that we talked to. Jane Weinglass on the upper left and clockwise, Kenny Williams, Phil Wilkinson, who I know has probably spoken with this group, Henrietta Smalls, Bill Mace. And then in the next slide, we have Pat Ferris, William Garrett, Mike Prevost, Gerald Austin, Stephanie Waldron, and Pierre Manigal. And so they were really authentic voices. And we have those archived, those interviews as well. You can listen to them or read the transcripts on the Low Country Digital Library. I'm going to have some freebies afterwards that include bookmarks. So it'll have the address of how to access those. But I just wanted to note that since that time, to date, 4 of these people have passed away. But we still have their voices to access and listen to. Okay, we have a rice field here. Whenever you look at a rice impoundment, it's important to understand how it was built and what happened there. I encountered a phrase from the 18th century that I named a chapter for. It's called the command of water. And the command of water was the ability on rice plantations to utilize water for irrigation, for weed control, for removing pests. Okay, now we're getting to some good maps. This 1873 coastal survey of South and North Santee, and you can see all those polygons in there, all those rice fields. I'm going to place this on the map. This is a Google Earth map that it's overlaid. So you can see in the upper left corner is McClellanville, and the upper right corner is where we are right now, Georgetown. So you can see the Santee Delta between. And I'm going to give you this map one more time, rotate it 90 degrees. So the ocean will be on your right, and you can see the North and the South Santees emptying into the ocean. And you see all those rice fields. So when you look at that, and you look at the number of those, what do you see? This is a question I'm looking for an answer from the audience. What do you see?
I see a lot of work.
Yes. An unimaginable amount of work done by enslaved people over a number of many, many years. There are probably hundreds of rice fields in the Santee Delta, and hundreds of miles of dikes. There weren't track hoes and bulldozers and dump trucks doing that work. It was people doing that. Monumental. It's often been described just here as like, this is like a pyramid. Well, when I talked to Phil Wilkinson about it, he says, no, it's more than one pyramid. It's many pyramids, the amount of work that's there. So one of the first steps was removing that swamp forest. Anyone up for that kind of work with a felling axe? This was not from, and this is not an 18th century photograph, obviously. This was from the removing of the swamp forest from one of the lakes to create the reservoir. We'll get to that later. But that was the first step in clearing the land. And then, of course, was building the embankments, the ditches, the canals, and then, of course, the rice trunks, which is featured here. This is from Hampton Plantation. And then this is another one from the North Santee River. These devices are still in use these days, the same design with the hanging gates that are used for waterfall management. This is from Richard Porcher and William Judd's book. This is a great illustration by Billy Judd. It's a terrific book, by the way. Marketplace Preparation of Rice. And here we see a cross-section of a rice trunk. On the left is the riverside, and on the right is the impoundment side. And one person, the trunk minder, could make those adjustments to control the amount of water coming in, even to small segments of an inch, how much water you want on the rice field, and then to remove it at another time. What was really important, though, in the Santee Delta is there was a salt wedge. So when the tide was pushing back in, the salt water was pushing, it created a wedge that went under the fresh water. So as it pushed it up, the fresh water on the incoming tide could still go into the rice fields without salt going in. And because of the amount of flow going down the Santee River, it allowed rice fields to be created all the way out onto the barrier islands like Cedar Island and Murphy Island, South Island. This is a great interpretive sign at Hampton Plantation looking out on Main Field, the name of one of the former rice fields. That's being colonized again by cypress and gums. But throughout the Low Country, rice culture and slavery is being interpreted throughout, and certainly in Hampton. So I'm going to do my first reading here. I know I'm juggling this mic, so I hope I'll try to keep it a little steadier. For this enterprise, planners marshaled the labor of a large enslaved workforce. The requirements of rice culture development and the need for slave labor stimulated the increased importation of enslaved West Africans to the Low Country. The work was brutal, dangerous, and often fatal for the enslaved laborers. It is difficult to comprehend the extent of the exertion required to accomplish the task described above. I have dropped small trees with an axe and grubbed out small stumps with hand tools. Yet from my efforts, I only have a meager sense of the historic ordeal. Add into the rice swamps the heat and humidity of a low-country summer day, the presence of biting insects filling the air and water moccasins underfoot, and the lack of suitable clothing and footwear, and you may distantly imagine the deadly difficulties of the labor. Alston's observation that, quote, the work is slow and arduous, week by week, etc., unquote, if considered over the long term by the enslaved, could easily have resulted in despair. How did people cope with this enslavement and enforced labor? How did they survive the deadly ordeal of transportation across the Middle Passage? According to some historians, the foundation of African religious and cultural beliefs enabled the survival and transition to the rice plantations for many Africans. This is a photograph from, thank you, Georgetown County Library, from Kinlaw Gun Club collection. This is a woman on Kinlaw Plantation that's harvesting in 1921 on the head a large section of rice. Now, when I talked about the command of water in the book, I also talked about how watercraft were part of that command too. And this is a rice flat. You can see it's square-ended and flat-bottomed. And it can carry many things. Obviously, it carried rice from the fields in the canals out to the landing. What's it carrying here on this day? You recognize that? It's a rice trunk, yes. So most likely these men were taking it to a place to install it. I hope they had more help than just the 5 men here, because that would be a considerable task to do. Other craft that were very important around the rice plantations were dugout canoes, easily built, and then the schooners, which could then take rice to market, go outside even. Okay, this is a photograph between Cat Island and South Island up in the Yawkey Wildlife Reserve. I have another story that had associated events with it, so I'm going to do a brief reading to give you the beginning of what occurred from a chapter called Terror and Death in the Delta. The May 27th, 1821 was eventful on South Island in the northeastern corner of the Santee Delta. Several runaway slaves were stealing livestock from the plantation of George Ford. They had been in the neighborhood for some time, perhaps months, living in a secluded camp. Though they had local allies, on this night, other slaves alerted Ford to the robbery. With the support of others, Ford set out to intervene, but in the confrontation, he was shot and killed. His death initiated a period of terror and revenge in the Delta and beyond. An ongoing hunt for the leader and identified killer, the infamous runaway Joe, also known as Forrest, would take over 2 years and cover 100 miles along the Santee River. So this occurred in May of 1821. As I read, they had a maroon camp on South Island. This is an illustration from Louisiana. But Joe was a freedom seeker. This was his personal revolt. He wasn't trying to go north or south. He was just living off the land. And his nickname, Forrest, was due to his ability to thrive in the forest, and certainly in the swamp forest. At one point, there were militias chasing Joe on both sides of the Santee River, and they came upon him at one point in his dugout canoe, and he left that dugout canoe and left his provisions and just went off on foot to escape. They didn't catch him then. The trial went cold. But a greater revolt was planned in the next year when they were still searching for him. And that was the Denmark-Vesey planned insurrection, summer of 1822. There were at least 1,000 people recruited for that insurrection, including into the Santee also. And as many of you know, that insurrection failed. The leaders were caught, and Vesey and others were hung. But it continued a high anxiety for people throughout the Low Country, for both African Americans and the whites. Let's go back to Murphy Island for a minute. This is an aerial photograph. How many of you have been out to Murphy Island? All right, okay. It's an incredible place, once known as Ori Island. It's southeastern barrier of the Santee Delta. And it's a real watery world. It's very flat. There's very little elevation, and yet people were living on it, cultivating rice. It was part of the plantation. And it also happened to be that fall, the ground zero for the Great Gale of 1822. Which was not a gale, it was a major hurricane, probably similar to Hugo. So that Island was just devastated. This is a photograph from my community from Hurricane Hugo in '89. But it was a comparable storm. There was a lot of death and destruction. Murphy Island probably got the worst of it. There were over 50 enslaved people that were killed. The overseer's family was also all killed in that storm. But there are some remnants of that storm. There are monuments to that great gale that were built that they don't exist anywhere else except in the Santee Delta. And these are the storm towers. They're circular brick buildings going up about 10 feet that had stairs inside that allowed people to go up if there was a big storm. And there are several that still exist. As you see, there are bricks missing. Why are the bricks missing? Because people want them as souvenirs. Isn't that terrible? It's terrible. So there's efforts to protect them for sure, because there are some extraordinary buildings. So going back briefly to the story of Joe, and what happened to Joe? I'm sorry, I can't give spoilers out for that. You know where you can read about it. A little more self-promotion here. Okay. Let's go back to Hampton Plantation and a chapter that I did on women of Hampton. This was a fascinating letter from Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who most of you know who that is, to her youngest son, Major Thomas Pinckney, at camp at Parker's Ferry in May 17, 1779. Harriet will write to you now if possible. She is happy in being able to assist her friends at this time. She sent for Sally and the children upon the first appearance of danger, and we were happy when we got them with us. Mrs. Middleton, and I'm not going to read further. This is a roll call of all the wives of the white, low country elite aligned with the revolution, with the revolt. So they had all evacuated there. Harriet was Harriet Pinckney Oree. And the danger, the British had already taken Savannah and they were marching across towards Charleston. So all these plantations were evacuated east of Charleston. And so many of these people evacuated to Hampton. You can imagine what the sleeping arrangements were in the mansion with all those people and children and the enslaved people that were with them. I'm sure Harriet did a lot of work around that, and there was a lot of cooking going on for this group. I mentioned earlier about the excavation of a slave dwelling at Hampton Plantation that Venny invited me to join. And so it was a really fascinating project. It involved the community. It was very neat. And so it really helped to look at the enslaved women of Hampton and what was going on with them, what their lives are like, because a lot of their stories, they're not archived, they're not written, like for the Rutledges and the Pinckneys and the Orees, but it found out a lot of information about them. Fascinating project. This is another remnant at Hampton that they have supported, and this was the home of Prince and Sue Alston. And in my book, I focus a lot on Eliza Lucas Pinckney in this chapter and on Sue Alston. Sue was a woman that worked for the Rutledges for over 70 years. She was known as the guardian angel of Hampton. Did you ever meet her? Yeah. Yeah, I think she died in '83 maybe. But she lived to 110 years old. So I definitely have, there were actually a number of the interviewees in my oral history project that knew her, and so I got some good stories from them. Let's go back to Murphy Island for a minute, shall we? For the story of two men two visitors to Murphy. And this was the tale of the two great canoeists. Who was the first canoeist? This was Nathaniel Holmes Bishop, who paddled, or he rowed, this paper canoe. It was made out of laminated paper from the Hudson River down the eastern seaboard, mainly in the inland waterways, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And he spent a night on Murphy Island. The second of the two great canoeists was Joshua Slocum. Joshua Slocum was an owner and captain of a sailing vessel, and his vessel became aground on an inlet in Brazil on the coast, and it broke apart. So rather than taking his wife and his two children back in a steamship to New England, he decided to scavenge what he could from that vessel and built this craft, which was launched on Emancipation Day in Brazil, the Liberdad. And he sailed it all the way up the coast, and his landfall was at Murphy Island, and he spent a night there with his family. So they're great stories. Both these men wrote, they're both Yankees, they both wrote about them, they both wrote books about them. Fascinating story, both of these adventurers. Now, I made a canoe trip out to Murphy Island myself with a fellow paddler, Ian Sanchez, who you see here paddling in the stern. On this trip, there was only one great canoeist, and that was Ian. I let him paddle in the stern. He was a motor. It was incredible. So we had a great trip there. But I did paddle too. I mean, I didn't just profile on the harbor here. I paddled also. And then we spent the first night on Murphy Island. That night it started raining, and the next day it was raining. So we paddled around Alligator Creek to the South Santee and out to Cedar Island, the next northern barrier island in the Delta. And it cleared up. It was beautiful. We got to see the sunset over Murphy Island. And then we also got to see the moon and Jupiter rising in the east that night. And we had to leave early the next morning before dawn. So, and we got to see the moon and Jupiter set over Murphy. And it was fog, there was fog, and we paddled out into the fog on our trip. It was, what a morning. I'll never forget it. And you know, that's one of the things about being in nature and the outdoors. I know many of you experience it too, but when you have the opportunity to be out there, you have these experiences of wonder and awe that are unforgettable. And this is one of those mornings that I'll never forget. The fog dissipated, so we were able to find our way. But it's a rough paddle going up the North Santee with the water flowing against you. If you stop, I meant to silence mine too, I forgot. I'm glad that's you and not me. Yeah, it was a hard paddle. This river was transformed back in the 1930s. I am going to silence mine now because I jinxed myself. Because if I don't, you know what Murphy's Law would say. I wonder if Murphy's Law was created. It's Christmas. Okay, so this was a major transformation in the 1930s, the Santee Cooper Project. You can see on this illustration from a collection at Clemson, the creation of the two lakes. The main purpose was for hydroelectric power, but it had some major transformations, not just up there, but all the way through the Santee Delta. I'm back to the man who's still chopping on that tree, felling it. This was from removing the swamp forest back in the reservoirs for the two lakes. Now, this gentleman is not dressed. He's not working in the field there. Look at him. He's dapper. He's got his leather jacket on, he's got his tie, his boots, his hat. He's profiling on the stump that he had no, I'm sure, he was not involved at all in the cutting down of that. So, funny picture. A selfie from the 1940, maybe. And then here's a dam going across to dam off the Santee River during construction. There were a lot of impacts in the Santee Delta. The flow of the river was much reduced. And what happened when that flow reduced? The salt water could come in more. So there was much increased salinity in the Santee Delta. And the other thing was what happened to the sediments. The project claimed that it was going to clear the sediments out of the Charleston Harbor. Didn't happen that way. They increased. So what they have to do? A rediversion project. But these sediments have also reduced the coast along here to the nearby barrier islands, and we're still experiencing that to this day, impact. I'm very interested in how the Santee Delta has been protected and is being protected. There were some natural protections. There's no deep water harbor, so it couldn't become a Charleston or a Georgetown. And there also are biting insects. Have any of you been out there when the biting insects have been thick? I learned a great cognitive strategy from Phil Wilkinson. He heard this from an elder, and the elder said, if you don't mind them, they won't worry you. Try it sometime. And then you'll cuss me probably for trying it. Okay, so, but a most important reason for protection of the Santee Delta was the Yankee purchase of lands. Why did that happen? Well, the impoundments were attracting migratory waterfowl. And those Yankee hunters really liked it. And there were bankrupt rice plantation owners that were willing to sell it to those Yankees. So they created some hunting clubs, and then there were just some private families, wealthy private families like the DuPonts and the Yorkies that purchased lands. This is from the Kinlaw plantation. And then here's a photograph of the Santee Gun Club, which became one of the largest of the gun clubs. And in 1974, the Santee Gun Club gave 24,000 acres of land to the Nature Conservancy, who then gave it to South Carolina to become the Santee Coastal Reserve. What a terrific place that is. And this is an example that I first heard several years ago of carpetbagger conservation. Buying up those lands and then giving it to the public. It also happened in the Northeast, the Cat Island and South Island and North Island, the lands that are owned by Tom Yorkie, who was, as you know, the owner of the Boston Red Sox. And in 1976, upon the death of Tom Yorkie, in his will, 20,000 acres of this land were given to the state of South Carolina to become the Tom Yorkie Wildlife Reserve. There was also a large chunk of money that Phil had recommended that there be, so there would be endowment to take care of those lands and study them. Private landowners have also done their due in the Santee Delta. A leader of that was Peter Manigault at Rochelle Plantation, who was the first person to create a conservation easement to place on the property. Conservation easements are voluntary, legal, permanent agreements that limit the use of land for conservation purposes. And there have been many that have followed. His neighbor and his friend Ted Turner was the second one to do that also. And many others have done that in the Santee Delta. This is a map that shows some of the public lands in the Delta. Upper right is the Yorkie Wildlife Reserve. Bottom green, the large sections is the Santee Coastal Reserve. You see another smaller green one upstream a little bit, the Santee Delta Wildlife Management Area, that's 17 runs right across. But during the writing the end of my book, when the end finally came, writing the epilogue and editing again, several big properties came for sale. The Wedge Plantation by USC came up for sale, and then another land upstream at the head of the Delta, Commander Island. Commander Island was 2,000 acres. It was acquired through the Open Space Institute and the Nature Conservancy. So 2,000 acres will be given to South Carolina DNR. I had the chance to go over that last spring. There was a Nature Conservancy person who was taking some potential donors out, and he said, yeah, I'll drop you off for the morning. So I got dropped off and wandered around the island. And don't worry, I was not walking in sandals and my pants rolled up on this island, because there are no paths or trails. I had to wade in. There was no way else to get in. But it's a neat place. I've also had the opportunity to do some kayak trips. I've done canoe trips too, but kayak trips out into the Delta. Here is where Hampton Creek goes out into the South Santee. That's looking right across at Commander Island, which is now called the Santee Island. I've also wandered around in the great watershed of the Santee River, and I wanted to go to the upper elevations. The upper places that water starts at Santee are up at Grandfather Mountain. This is in Linville Gorge, which is, again, not too far downstream from Grandfather Mountain. And 50 years ago, I first went to Linville Gorge. It's a wilderness area. So here it is, 50 years later, the faded out Bob back in the early 70s, and then just in August. And I felt the 50 years in those hikes. I definitely felt it. Okay, I do have a website that I have some information on it that I want to make available to you all. So I'm going to have, besides books for sale afterwards, we've got some freebies too. I have bookmarks for everyone that has my web address on it. On this website, I have a page that gives public access into the Santee Delta. Great places to go, like Hampton Plantation, Santee Coastal Reserve, Yawkey Wildlife Center. I also have been doing a blog for almost 15 years now, and I do ongoing posts to that. So if you'd like to be included to get notifications on that, I'll have a sign up for you afterwards. That's up to you, but you're welcome to sign up. Yes. And I do have a way to access how you can get to those Voices of the Santee Delta Oral History Project if you want to review any of that or listen to those voices. So in conclusion, the Santee Delta is a real treasure of a place that we're fortunate to have in the Lowcountry, but also in South Carolina. It's a place of nature and wildlife. It's great habitats, the rich history of rice culture. It's a place of adventure that I've had a few, and discovery, and it's a place of wildness. It's a wild place. So on that, I'm gonna stop and entertain any questions. Thank you. Questions? Yes, sir.
Who selected the site? Was it African or was it a settler? Who selected the site of the Santee Delta? Who decided to grow rice there?
Who made that decision? Those decisions were the rice planters, the whites. They were marshaling the forces of the enslaved laborers to do the work.
So, but the rice planters got their information from the blacks.
Yes, and that's why, I'm going to let you come in on here. That's why they often were recruited from the rice growing areas of West Africa, and because they were experienced in that rice culture. So yes, they knew the process, they knew what to do. And those lands along the delta were initially really colonized by the Huguenots. Yes. Benny, you want to add to that?
I want to say what you said.
You want to say, okay, yeah.
Very close to West Africa.
Right. The Gambia. Yes. Yeah. Sierra Leone. Yeah. Yes. Yes, sir.
Has anyone charted the depths of the Santee, South or North Santee, the water depths, and has it changed greatly since the time that the rice fields were there?
Oh, well, I know it's changed. It continues to change. But in terms of charts by NOAA, I don't have those charts. When I sail my little sunfish, I have a dagger board. That's my depth finder. When I hit, oh yeah, I stop suddenly and I either pull it up or go somewhere else. Yeah, so, but there's lots of navigable waters, but there's lots of shoals too. So it's important to have the local knowledge when you go out there. Does anyone go out on those waters in a boat regularly? Yeah?
I mean, there are charts for those rivers.
How far up?
Off the top of my head, I can't answer that question, but I know there are charts that show water depth.
Yes, and I've got the local charts that are adjacent to the Intercoastal Waterway. Right. So obviously those are well charted. Yes. Yeah, Bob?
Archibald Rutledge was very strongly opposed to the dams. Was there a strong movement to try to prevent that from happening?
There was, and in the chapter about that, which I called They Changed the River, and I got that phrase from Pat Ferris. I heard that and I said, oh, they changed the river. They did. There was a strong movement, and I cover that, but Archibald Rutledge wrote an article in a magazine, and the title was Damn Everything. But he realized it was done, and there's nothing could do about it, but he was just interested in what were going to be some of the effects, especially on the wildlife, the fish, for sure. But yes, the Santee Gun Club, major, but there was lots of pushback to that opposition. Roger Torrey Peterson made a 10-day canoe trip down the Santee before it. He was looking for all the wildlife there. He was looking for the ivory-billed woodpecker too. Didn't find it, but it was still, there were ivory-billed woodpeckers were sighted in the 1930s in the upper parts of the, just west of the Delta. But there was a lot of pushback, and it was war. And, the war was, when that happened in the 40s and afterwards, because there was a lot saying, we need to have this flow coming down the river. And it was like, no, we need it for power. This is going to be a battle of building things, and we need the power for that. But I do cover that some. Other questions, Vinny?
I just have to tell you, thank you so much, because no one understands what you went through. Because I attempted to do what you did, and I just have two stories to give you. The first one is when I went with Dr. Poche, who's an amazing man, to a rice field, and all the rice field mainly were named, and this one is, I'll never forget, it's Tranquility. I'll never forget the name.
It's in the middle of the Delta. It's between the North and the Santee, Tranquility. So in that flat area.
Yeah, and I walked with the other biologists and stuff, and I could not make it. They literally had to signal the boat to come back around to pick me up, because they said I wasn't going to make it back to the other end, because it was so exhausting, and I sunk into the swamp.
How deep? Knees? Hip? Oh, chest?
Yeah, chest. And I went Dr. Crochet said, the more you move, the more you sink. Don't move. And he put a cane out, and I'll just make the end of the story is that I went home with my mom, because my mom was a rice girl. And she said, you went where, when? And she said, don't you ever do that again. And she said, we have lost whole cows out in us. Whole cows.
Oh, yeah.
We could not take animals up there. And the last thing I want to say is I got invited to work Yawkey when I first moved to Georgetown. And I went out there to do a dig with Joey. And I got bitten by, I don't know, I think they call it a mayfly, or is that big a fly?
Well, there are a range of flies. The big ones are the green-headed flies. They call them horse flies, yeah.
Okay, well, but anyway, when I got bitten, when I first got back here 2 to 3 years ago, I asked Joey, I said, did I sign a contract? And she said, no, you haven't yet. I said, I'm not planning on it. I'll be get the heck out of here. So anyway, and last thing is that our dig at Hampton was 5 years. That was an overnight dig.
Oh, yeah. No, it was an
So that's it.
extended project,
It
yes.
was very extended.
Thanks. And remember, Vinny, about that. If you don't mind them, they won't worry you. Anyone else? Yes.
I read somewhere that those storm towers had floating floors in them. Was that true? As the water came up, the floor would rise within that building? Or,
I thought that they were fixed. Well, the article I saw, they were fixed at the height, and there was a roof over it.
okay, so they could go upstairs?
They had stairs to go up.
Okay.
Yeah, there were stairs on the interior.
Those then,
No, just up to that 10-foot
or
level.
roof level?
Yes. Well, the roof over that, the floor. Yeah, but they really have tried to, one of those intact storm towers is on private land, and it's sort of a hunt club house now, and it's been renovated for that. The other one is on public lands, but it needs a lot of protection, and there are just trees growing up on the inside of it, you know, above the walls, and yeah, it's rough. Anything else? Thank you all. You've been a great audience.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. We do have one.
They take the dams down. What do they do with the dams? They have the dams, are they still in place?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. But they did a rediversion project. They rediverted the water, and it just cost a lot of money, but there were still the sediment issues. Yes. No, the lakes are there. Moultrie.
Lake Marion and Lake Moultrie. And Marion's is named, if I get correctly, that's where his home was. I mean, his birthplace is under the lake. Or what? Yeah, is under the lake. So that's what those two big lakes that are up above Monk's Corner and going farther north are all. That's the result of those dams. Yeah. Bob, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Yes.
And if anyone is interested in getting the book, I'll be happy to inscribe it out in the lobby. And we got freebies too.
Yeah. So the three books are.
It's off.
The three books. The three books are for sale back there. You want to pick up a copy of that. I just again want to express appreciation. They're not here, but to Dedrick Bonds and the board of the auditorium here who have allowed us to be able to use this facility. The library construction, I was talking to a few of you earlier, is coming along quite well. Met with Dwight McInvale yesterday, and a group of us were together, and they're about 3 or 4 weeks ahead of schedule. That's a rarity in construction, but they figure it'll catch up. It's nice to have that extra time. But the anticipated opening is sometime late spring, early summer for reopening the library. In the interim, there is a facility at the Howard Center, really nice. Again, I was talking to staff yesterday, and they were really pleased with the number of people who are taking advantage of that, where they have access there to books if you wish. And they have a wonderful children's program, a large room for children's programs that are going on there as well. I want to encourage you to continue to participate in Friends events. It is not changing anything for us. As you can tell, we're continuing with our Tuesdays with. There's a full schedule on the table back where Carol will be with the books. If you want to pick up a schedule of what's coming up. Next is Paige Sawyer. Always in terms of events, try to give recognition in the month of November to our veterans. And he's giving a presentation. Many of you know Paige, excellent speaker, photographer, historian. Paige is going to be speaking on Unapologetically American. And that'll be our presentation. It's always the third Tuesday of each month, and it'll be the third Tuesday back here at the auditorium. I want to mention also For those who are book sell people with us, we finished up a very successful late spring, summer, and early fall at the farmers market. Appreciated the opportunity to be able to be there. Sold over $3,000 worth of books in a period of time that was shorter than last summer, and actually about $500–600 more made this summer. It's been a wonderful experience there at the farmers market. This coming Saturday with the Wooden Boat Show, we've been invited very kindly and generously by the Wooden Boat Show group to have a book table. All books on marine kinds of things, fiction and nonfiction. And we'll be selling books there in front of Tomlinson. So stop by and pick up some books from the Friends of the Georgetown Library. I will warn you ahead of time, they're a little more expensive than they were at the farmer's market. You should have bought them then. But not that much more, and still a great opportunity to be able to contribute to the Friends. And then the following week, we have the Saturday the 28th is going to be our delayed community yard sale. That was going to be last Saturday, and that rain early in the morning threw us off. And so we have a community yard sale that'll be in the parking lot behind the library, the new courthouse parking lot. We already have 27 vendors. That's the most we've ever had. A lot of people coming to sell their stuff. Anyway, so we hope you'll come. We'll also have a book table there for the Friends, but just a lot of fun. That's from 8 o'clock in the morning till noon. And then finally, our Yuletide Home Tour is on calendar. And again, going to be taking place. We've been, again, appreciating the fact as we are homeless, and that's usually where people went to sign up and get their tickets and map at the library. Prince George Winyall Church has graciously opened their doors and are allowing us to be able to use their facility as our home, as it were, for that day. But we already have more than 10 homes, several of which are brand new to the tour. A number of others are renovated and developed, so it'll be a great tour that day. In addition to that, we are going to be doing 2 houses of worship, as well as 2 museums. The response last year to the museum inclusion was very positive. And once again, we're going to be having the Kaminsky House Museum, as well as the Gullah Museum as a part of the tour. So it's just that's Saturday, December 9th. It's the second Saturday, thank you. And that's from 1 o'clock in the afternoon to 5. We're going to be putting out announcements soon. Surprise, surprise, the Friends of the Library have entered the 21st century. We are going to have a website where you can buy tickets and you can use a credit card. We have finally entered the 21st century. Word will be going out on that, but we'll have an announcement out, and most of you are probably on our email list, and you'll get the announcement on the date, Saturday, December 9th. It's always the second Saturday. The first Saturday, we don't want to compete with the parade. So we come the second Saturday, and that's always worked well for us. I think that's all of our upcoming events and thanks and so forth, but one more thanks to Bob. Really appreciate your presentation today. Thank you. And make sure you pick up a book and get a signature on there. You get it signed all the more. Thank you, everyone.